This lecture explores both feminist and mainstream cultural discourses about women who refuse an ethical commitment to collectivity and whose politics differ from the largely left-leaning feminist project. It also examines how avowedly and vocally selfish women view feminism and indeed women. Here I revisit the works and words of two arch-female individualists, the decadent French woman writer Rachilde, who wrote a tract dedicated to explaining her opposition to feminism in 1928, and the Russian-American writer Ayn Rand, whose philosophy of objectivism describes the pursuit of, quote, rational selfishness. And in a final and shorter section, I consider the role of the UK's own first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who became a cultural repository for anxieties about powerful, individualistic, selfish women, and whose own self-presentation embodies some of the contradictions and difficulties of propounding a discourse of selfishness while female. In contemporary feminist parlance, women who achieve individual advancement and personal economic emancipation within the capitalist Western framework are often labelled exceptional women, signifying that their advancement has been achieved despite their gender rather than as part of a project of collective gain for all women. Such women are perceived then to serve a patriarchal function, since their success can be held up as an argument that structural disadvantages, such as the glass ceiling, do not really exist after all, on the basis of the exception that proves the rule. Exceptional woman syndrome is frequently used to signify the selfishness of women who lack both an awareness of the rarity and precariousness of their own position and a sense of solidarity with other women. Exceptionality has a second set of associations that are also relevant to this project. Currents in 19th century European philosophy and the aesthetic school of Romanticism inaugurated the age of the modern individual by imagining a singular figure, a sovereign subject to whom the usual rules and moral codes that control the masses do not apply. In Nietzschean terms, the exceptional subject is the Übermensch, a superman, a genius, artist, outsider, or, as I've explored elsewhere, a master criminal figure. That this figure is the fantasy creation of a masculine imagination and almost without exception figured as male makes it an intriguing precedent, but a precedent nonetheless, for the conception of subjectivity imagined by these selfish women. Both Rachilde and Ayn Rand propound discourses of exceptionalism in this sense, both to set themselves apart from the common run of women, and to imagine fictional characters of both sexes whose achievements and originality transcend the rules of the norm. The concept of individualism, the individual, that originated in the 19th century has become, in our neoliberal moment, a freighted, tainted concept, derided by critics of capitalism as ethically impoverished and a philosophically dubious form of subjectivity. The ideal of individualism is today used as a seductive, commercial tool, encouraging citizens to rebrand themselves as consumers and selling them a perfectible version of the self in line with Foucault's analysis of the docile bodies of modernity. Modern Western humans then identify with and internalise the subjectivizing discourses of consumerism, which appear via the smoke and mirrors of neoliberalism as gestures of authentic identity. Critics of what has been known as, or as what has become known recently as post-feminism, of which I consider myself one, decry the degree to which contemporary media and political discourses exhort women to adopt a rhetoric of individual empowerment, often through lifestyle and consumer choices, as an alternative to critique of those very choices. And this is an issue to which I will return at the end of the lecture. However, it would be a mistake to assume that a suspicion of neoliberalism and the version of individualism that we have been sold today has to equate to an unquestioning endorsement of the concept of collectivism as an untainted or self-evident good. It bears stating that collectivism qua ethic is often itself heavily gendered, such that the very premise of feminist solidarity can be seen to be overburdened with reliance on the stereotype of women as naturally predisposed towards favouring collaborative, caring and community-based modes of working and forms of action. This in and of itself can be an essentialising straitjacket for women. And it is perhaps unsurprising that the more glamorous and personally pleasurable versions of an, albeit dubiously, feminist message might appeal to women who do not wish to put the interests of others above themselves, as women have been taught is their proper role for centuries, or yet to introverted, reclusive, or unsociable women. Work on the feminist ethics of care associated with Carol Gilligan and her 1982 book In a Different Voice perhaps most explicitly embodies the idea of women as somehow innately predisposed to collectivity from a feminist point of view. Gilligan argues that women differ from men in their very approach to morality. Men prefer a morality of rights, she claims, while women prefer a morality of responsibility. The former emphasises separateness and individuality, while the latter is underpinned by a concern with connections and relatedness. Gilligan's gesture in this book is a rebuttal to previous, prevalent, misogynistic modern ideas, such as Sigmund Freud's claim that women's morality and sense of justice are less fully developed than men's. Quote, "It must be admitted that women have but little sense of justice, and this is no doubt connected with the preponderance of envy in their mental life." Gilligan argues that the ethic of care and responsibility is at least as valid and mature as the ethic of rights and justice. It is possible then to see a strategy of what Foucault would call discourse and reverse discourse here. The sciences tell women that they are morally inferior. Feminists respond, motivated by justifiable outrage, with assertions that, to the contrary, women's innate characteristics accord them a superior morality. The flaw in this response strategy is the acceptance of the underlying assumption that there is this innate nature of women that needs to be defined and asserted as morally superior or inferior, and that this nature is altruism. This fundamental political error leads to a number of logical aporia and political traps in thinking. In turning to Rachilde and Rand, women whose ethics, politics and aesthetics could not possibly be further from Gilligan's ethic of care, my aim is not to recuperate these avowedly anti-feminist names for a reconstituted genealogy of feminism in a sort of perverse reading against the grain. Rather, I aim to look at how figures who reject and are rejected in turn by feminism pose interesting questions about feminism's own biases and internal rules, and about the sort of female subject deemed its proper subject. This project in part arises from the research I took for my book, The Subject of Murder, Gender, Exceptionality and the Modern Killer. In writing that book, it was to the figure of Myra Hindley that my attention kept returning. Hindley, as a woman complicit in the killing of children, represented not only an understandable hate figure for the 1960s gutter press, but also an embarrassment for feminism, a betrayal, it seems, of what feminism required women to be in order even to be counted as women at all and worthy of representation. Few feminists at the time, with the notable exception of Germaine Greer, were willing to consider that the disproportionate hatred that accrued to Hindley in comparison to her lover Ian Brady had everything to do with her transgression of the feminine role of caregiver, a transgression that made her crimes appear far worse than those of her male partner, which were understandable as a mere extension of masculinity, rather than as a categorical travesty of nature. You may think that this is a very extreme example of the phenomenon I'm exploring today, the selfish woman. However, I would share with you an anecdote. I've encountered more consternation and shock from my feminist and leftist colleagues when I've told them that I'm working on Rand and Thatcher than when I spoke about my research on Hindley. It has been suggested that by giving time to a reading of Rand rather than to reading feminist writers, or to thinking about Thatcher rather than focusing on the victims of her policies, I am somehow betraying a feminist project. I find this extraordinary. We might assume that a feminist ethics would wish to admit that the full range of human attitudes and characteristics will be held by women as well as by men, since feminism is sometimes described as, quote, the radical notion that women are human beings, a definition attributed to Cheris Cremeret. To deny women any legitimate recourse to selfishness or radical self-interest appears to be to short-circuit the achievement of that radical idea, and to fall back on a reactionary and one-dimensional view of women as natural, altruistic caregivers. It seems then that of all gender heretical figures, and for those of all political stripes, the selfish woman is the most inconvenient of deviants. Of all the authors I've researched and written on in my time as a professor of French Discourses of Sexuality, one of the most enduringly fascinating to me is the decadent woman writer Rachilde, pen name of Marguerite Thatcher, who lived for almost a century from 1860 to 1953. In previous projects, I've situated Rachilde as a sometimes imitative, sometimes parodic and therefore deconstructive commentator on the discursive fashions of her time, literary decadence, sexology and degeneration theory. In that context, Rachilde presents a uniquely dissident female voice in an overwhelmingly male and explicitly masculinist discursive field. In this lecture, I consider Rachilde in slightly different terms, as both an avowed individualist and as a vocal enemy of feminism. Rachilde's biographer Diana Holmes has described the decadence at the turn of the century in France as instinctively more right than left-wing in their rejection of democracy, which they understood as, quote, the reign of the barbarians. Yet, unlike the establishmentarian French right-wing, they were also largely anarchic and countercultural in their critique of bourgeois mores and morality, and in their morbid and ambivalent celebration of the perceived grand decline of society. The decadents then were that paradox, a group of individualists. Yet, significantly, Rachilde's work was not critiqued as immoral in terms of its decadent thematics or its individualistic antisocial thrust per se. Rather, it was critiqued in specifically gendered terms. For a woman to have imagined the strong, perverse protagonists against society who populate her novels led to her being diagnosed as suffering from a specifically feminine kind of neurosis. The themes in Rachilde's work, gender inversion, sexual perversion, and Baroque violence, were not at all unusual in the context of decadent writing. But whereas in response to the works of her male contemporaries, such as Maurice Rollinin, critics like Jules Boissière and Henri Fouquier espied subtle parody and social critique in such tropes, they termed Rachilde and her work instead variously sadique, sadistic, ghoulish, and perverted. Even Maurice Barrès, a professed admirer of Rachilde, wrote in the preface of her novel of gender inversion, Monsieur Vénus, of 1884, that it was the product of la maladie du siècle, the malady of the century, i.e. hysteria, and that Rachilde, then a young woman of 20, must be understood as une nerveuse, a neurotic, une fiévreuse, a feverish woman, gouvernée uniquement par l'instinct, uniquely governed by instinct. So, more recently, I've become interested in the extraordinarily unpopular yet influential proponent of unbridled capitalism and preacher of the virtue of selfishness, Ayn Rand, born Elisa Rosenbaum in St. Petersburg in 1905, having died in 1982. Her writing and her political philosophy of objectivism are cited as major influences on contemporary right-wing American politics. Figures such as Senator Rand Paul and Republican Congressman Paul Ryan profess admiration for her. Her best-known novel, Atlas Shrugged, of 1957, which tells the story of a strike undertaken by the most brilliant and productive of society's individuals at the behest of the mysterious John Galt, the man who stopped the motor of the world, has been described as the most influential book in America after the Bible. And Ayn Rand has been described by philosophers Douglas Deneuve and Douglas Rasmussen, it's hard to say, as among the most controversial figures of our time. At the most superficial level, the controversy can be traced to her single-minded pursuit of the ideal of what she called rational selfishness as the highest moral principle, while denouncing altruism, conversely, as an evil. In a famed television interview with Phil Donahue from 1979, Rand explains why, for her, altruism is wrong.
You don't go for altruism and charity and do-good and liberal and...
No. And conservative. You might as well add it all.
You don't like the conservatives either?
No.
Well,
Lots of ways conservative.
Right. I want to help people. I want to do good for other people. What's so bad about that?
Nothing. If you do it by your own choice, and if it's not your primary aim in life, and if you don't regard it as a moral virtue. On those conditions, it's fine to help people if you want to.
Why can't I think of it as a moral virtue? I mean, can I take some vows for myself for doing all these good things?
Because that would be cannibalism. Because that would mean that you preach altruism, which means not merely kindness, but self-sacrifice. It means that you place the welfare of others above your own, that you live for others, for the sake of helping them, and that justifies your life. That's immoral, according to my morality.
But I felt she could explain her theory better than I could. Despite the tremendous influence of Rand, many critics dismiss her writing and philosophy as childish and as naively melodramatic, as appealing to impressionable college students rather than to adult thinkers. I find this charge particularly telling, as the combination of selfishness or narcissism and being female has tended to make selfish women the objects of pathologizing discourses of immaturity throughout the history of the sciences, since a mature woman is defined in psychoanalytic discourse precisely as caregiver, childbearer, whose narcissism has found its properly feminine, that is, secondary form through affect for her children. This lends authority to the dismissal of unrepentantly selfish women, such as Ayn Rand, as less than full adult subjects and as doubly aberrant on grounds that are not solely related to what it is that she says. That this interpretation is not an exaggeration can be seen by examining a review of Atlas Shrugged by Whittaker Chambers, a former communist spy turned Christian, in the National Review. Chambers writes that Rand's dictatorial tone suggests to him that, quote, children probably irk the author and make her uneasy. That such a comment would be made of a male author is unthinkable. What is being taken to task here is Rand's failure at appropriate femininity. Chambers then goes on, with outrageous hyperbole, from almost any page of Atlas Shrugged, a voice can be heard from painful necessity, commanding, to a gas chamber go. And in similarly exaggerated tones, Gore Vidal writes of Atlas that Ayn Rand's philosophy is nearly perfect in its immorality. Now, Rand consistently denied that the hostility she faced as a philosopher and the brutal critical responses elicited by her fiction work had anything at all to do with her status as a female thinker and writer. Yet Barbara Brandon, her close friend and biographer, claims that in the business of being a published writer and philosopher, Rand was greatly hindered by being a woman. She believes that these extreme and hyperbolic critical responses have as much to do with their author being female as with the arguably rebarbative elitism of her message. Indeed, if one thinks of the kind of violently misogynistic and individual male-glorifying material written by contemporary male American authors, such as Henry Miller and Norman Mailer, who explicitly liken the psychopath to, quote, the hero of our age, in an essay published in the self-same year as Atlas Shrugged, and who face much less moral and aesthetic condemnation, it becomes likely that it is in large part Rand's gender that leads to Atlas Shrugged being demonised quite to this degree and quite in these terms. The misogynistic critical responses faced by both Rachilde and Rand should logically have made them candidates for a feminist agenda, yet nothing could be further from the truth. In her 1928 tract Pourquoi je ne suis pas féministe, Why I'm Not a Feminist, Rachilde explains that, I'll read it in English, the French is up there for those who have French. I've always acted as an individual, never thinking of founding a society or overturning the one that exists. And Rand objects to feminism precisely on the grounds that feminists elevate their gender above their individuality, creating a form of collectivism that she can only associate with the hated Soviet communism of her childhood, while believing that, quote, the notion that a woman's place is in the home is an ancient primitive evil, end quote, she was nevertheless unwilling to support the idea of women as a class sharing a claim to any particular rights or agenda. Adopting wholesale the discourses about women that characterise her cultural moment and that coloured the pathologising and reductive critical reception of her work, Rachilde figures women as physiologically and psychologically weaker than, and therefore inferior to, men. She writes, women are secondary when it comes to strength, la femme est seconde en force, and women are the inferior siblings of men because they have physical weakness. Les femmes sont les frères inférieurs de l'homme simplement parce qu'elles ont de misère physique. And, echoing the logic of feminine nervous frailty and hysterical neurosis voiced by male literary critics, Rachilde writes, Je suis une créature douée comme toutes les femmes d'excessive névrosité. I am a creature endowed like all women with excessive neurosis. Rachilde has operated a schizoid view of herself throughout her writing. On the one hand, she argues for her right to freedom as an individual social and creative agent, who, in proto-Randian terms, claims j'aime par-dessus la logique, I love logic above all things. On the other, accepting that insofar as she was biologically and psychologically a woman, she was irredeemably less than a man. That the notion of identifying proudly as a woman writer or feminist should have been unthinkable to Rachilde is perfectly understandable in light of this cognitive dissonance. And it is unsurprising that Rachilde's calling card bore the legend Rachilde homme de lettres, Rachilde man of letters. Rand, too, seems to have been invested in a surprisingly traditional view of psychological femininity that was entirely at odds with her assertions that career and worldly achievement should be just as important to women as to men, and that they were equally capable of excellence in the creative and productive spheres. Rand argued, bizarrely, that for a woman qua woman, the essence of femininity is hero worship, the desire to look up to a man. Her lover, Nathaniel Brandon, cites the following conversation he had with Rand. I asked her, don't men worship women? I mean the women they love. Oh, I suppose so, but that's not how I would think of it. By worship, I mean our highest capacity for admiration, reverence, looking up. I see man as superior to woman, and, oh, Ayn, I protested, you don't, you're joking. I am not joking, she answers seriously. Superior in what? Intelligence, creativity, moral worth? No, of course not. In spiritual or intellectual matters, the sexes are equal. But man is bigger, stronger, faster, better able to cope with nature. Rand's essentialist view of female inferiority based on biology is expressed in terms that are very similar to Rachilde's. And while Rand once stated, with perfect misogyny and in the embrace of a heterosexist straitjacket, that she would not want to be a man because then she would have to love a woman, Rachilde wrote, more thoughtfully, I'm going to read it in English again. I've always regretted that I wasn't a man. Not because I value one half of humanity more than the other half, but because, obligated by duty or taste to live like a man, to carry all alone the heavy burden of life during my youth, it would have been preferable to have at least had the privileges of being male. This strikingly insightful comment shows Rachilde's frustration with the fact that in her culture, the only way to operate as a full agentic subject and to have one's strengths recognised would be to be male. Yet she does not conclude from this that the way to achieve her desired right to personhood would be to make common cause with other women who might have the same frustrations and ambitions, and to attempt to change society. Rather, she accepts that in preferring logic and desiring an active social role, she must take up the mantle of honorary man, both literally by cross-dressing while out in the public sphere, linguistically by revelling in the title of man of letters and Mademoiselle Baudelaire, a sobriquet given to her by Maurice Barrès, and in consciously embracing and identifying with a stereotypical masculine perspective, including the denigration of women as naturally inferior. Similarly, in the introduction of the one existing book devoted to the subject of feminist interpretations of Rand, editors Gladstein and Sciabara contextualise that, quote, for many contemporary feminists, Rand must be viewed as a masculinist in her exaltation of the role of consciousness and reason, echoing Susan Brown Miller's opinion that Rand is, quote, a traitor to her sex, quote, spiritually male, and, quote, an example of the ways in which a strong male-directed woman accommodates herself to what she considers to be superior male thought. Indeed, biographer Brandon recounts the following anecdote. Henry Azlitt said one day to Ayn Rand, I just talked with Lou Mises a few days ago. He called you the most courageous man in America. Did he say man? Asked Ayn. Yes, Hazlitt replied. Ayn was delighted. The notion of a woman having to be like a man in order to express agency is an idea that carries across into the two writers' fiction. While some feminist critics have celebrated the innovative game of gender bending in Rachilde's work as sexually transgressive and daring, others have argued that it demonstrates the degree to which Rachilde can only imagine autonomy and agency for her female characters if she renders them masculine or honorary males, using the gendered French language to emphasise this. In Monsieur Venus, the dominant female aristocrat, Raoul de Vénérande, is progressively addressed and discussed using male titles and pronouns. She becomes Monsieur de Vénérande, il, le mari, the husband. While Jacques Silver, Raoul's effeminate and increasingly feminized lover, becomes Mademoiselle Silver. Individualism and agency are understood as masculine traits, incompatible with identification as female. And the being of a selfish female protagonist, it seems, can only be expressed in terms of an adopted role of masculinity. Similarly, in Atlas Shrugged, Rand's strong female protagonist Dagny Taggart, the COO of Taggart Transcontinental Railway, responds to her sister-in-law's announcement, I'm the woman of the family now, with the words, that's quite all right, I'm the man. Only very occasionally in her fictional writing does Rachilde gesture towards what we might call a specifically female revolt of the self, a revolt against what culture tells women that they are, and what she herself has claimed they are in Pourquoi je ne suis pas féministe, without falling back on an adoption of masculinity. La Marquise de Sade of 1887 tells the story of Marie Barbe, the eponymous female version of the divine Marquis. Not coincidentally, Sade is, of course, one of the key proponents of the exceptional sovereign subject, the superior individual, inaugurated at the dawn of modernity. La Marquise de Sade explores Marie's development from a little girl frightened by the sight of an ox being slaughtered in an abattoir into a willful, egotistical, and sexually sadistic young woman who identifies with and internalizes the brutality that she understands to be the guiding principle of her culture, and which she decides to visit in revenge for slights upon herself and other women upon the male. Addressing her new husband, Louis de Caumont, on their wedding night, Marie makes the following statement about selfhood, about the social expectations of women, and about her refusal of the social imperative in favour of a solipsistic assertion of being. Louis, I have decided not to bear you an heir. I don't want to get ugly nor to suffer. What is more, I am enough just by being, and if I could end the world along with me when I die, I would end it. The rareness of the position being articulated here is borne out by Rachilde's insistence on the typographical peculiarities seen in the piece of dialogue. The italics and uppercase letters that appeared in the manuscript were to be scrupulously replicated in published editions of La Marquise. Words which express that which is not habitually expressed appear in a form that sets them apart from regular speech. The I am enough bespeaks disobedience to 3 discourses about what women are supposed to be. Firstly, subject to a psychological need of childbearing in order to justify their own lives. Secondly, the compliments of men in a heteropatriarchal logic that is as self-serving as it is tendentious. And 3, profoundly social animals, natural carers for others, and essentially predisposed to be for the interests of collectivity. It is in this third regard that Rachilde's character's gesture of refusal of female selflessness, her insistence instead on self-fullness, is most pertinent for the larger argument I'm making. In the case of Rachilde, then, it is in fiction rather than non-fiction that the voice of female selfishness articulates itself, albeit occasionally, and in refreshing bursts of textual exuberance, in terms that have to do with providing a thoroughgoing rebuttal of, and indeed counter-discourse to, the commonplace idea of woman's role and relationship to selfhood. Similarly, it can be argued that in some, if definitely not all, of Rand's fiction, we may find some accommodation of her insistence that women are not inferior to men, despite her less than enlightening comments on female psychology, as defined by her principle of feminine hero worship. In an article from 1978, Mimi Gladstein discusses her controversial choice to set Atlas Shrugged as a core text on her women's studies syllabus, under the rubric of the liberated woman or she who succeeds. Gladstein bemoans a dearth of American literature that depicts a female character who, quote, is independent, active, professionally successful, sexually emancipated, and doesn't pay for it by dying in childbirth or going mad. Gladstein is not alone in celebrating the character of Dagny Taggart. Tennis stars Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova, and Chris Evert all independently cited the fictional female railroad hero as an inspiration. I just like that anecdote, I think I need to know. Rand has also stated that Dagny Taggart is the ideal woman, writing, quote, I had always been somewhat frustrated by my presentation of women and eager to present my kind of woman. It is also via Dagny that Rand allows herself to articulate the fact that an agentic woman in the public sphere may face extra biases and barriers that have to do not with her individual competence, but with the role society expects women to play, an admission Rand refused to make about her own career trajectory and critical reception, So I quote from Atlas Shrugged, it's quite long, isn't it? "You're unbearably conceited" was one of the 2 sentences she heard throughout her childhood, even though she never spoke of her own ability. The other sentence was, "You're selfish." She asked what was meant, but never received an answer. She looked at the adults, wondering how they could imagine that she would feel guilt from an undefined accusation. She was 12 years old when she first told Eddie Willers that she would run the railroad when they grew up. She was 15 when it occurred to her for the first time that women did not run railroads and that people might object. To hell with that, she thought, and never worried about it again. And it is also left to Dagny to articulate some of the complexities of negotiating between contemporary cultural expectations of domestic femininity and individual, in this case heterosexual, desire, complexities that Rand qua Rand downplays. The fact that despite her blanket dismissal of feminism, Rand would very much admire Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and its critique of compulsory domesticity in 1963 is perhaps already visible in 1957 when she has Dagny musing, "There is a reason," she thought, "why a woman would wish to cook for a man. Oh, not as a duty, as a chronic career, only as a rare and special right in symbol of... But what have they made of it, the preachers of women's duty, the castrated performance of a sickening drudgery, which was held to be a woman's proper virtue?" The suspension points and disjointedness in this extract are atypical of Rand's prose style and indeed of Dagny's thought processes. Both tend to favour a precision and unambiguousness that makes the prose rather hard-going to read, and are characteristics of the vaunted, if psychologically unrealistic, pure rationality of objectivism. I would suggest that, as in the case of the typographically odd Rachilde quotation, the syntactical awkwardness here reveals the difficulty of articulating the position that Rand and Dagny gesture towards. For Rand to ever admit that the constraints that society places upon women may materially reduce their capacity to achieve greatness, or to know why it is that they might desire to do certain things, is for her to admit that men and women do not face equal odds in their life struggles, and that female individualism, female heroism, is socially harder won than the male counterpart. A purely biological rationale, men are stronger than women and better adapted to nature, does not account wholly for the difficulties faced by women in the public and professional sphere. One of the fascinating and frustrating aspects, then, of both Rachilde's and Ayn Rand's writing is the way in which it is in some ways radical and daring for its time, while in other ways stultifyingly reactionary. Both Rachilde and Rand were women who wrote against many of the most dearly held tenets of their culture. Rachilde used the decadent philosophy's rejection of society as a context and pretext for putting her character Marie Barbe into the role of social and sexual agent, the perverse destroyer of family authority, a solipsistic innovator of woman's right simply to be for herself. Rand created the one female protagonist that a women's studies professor in the 70s considered worthy of featuring in her university course as an example of a proper heroine. Moreover, Rand argued unpopularly in the conservative 1950s for a woman's right to a career and equal pay. She supported the right to abortion, calling it, quote, a moral right which should be left to the sole discretion of the woman concerned. And she detested the dogmatic religiosity of the US right. Yet despite their own forms of radicalism, both authors are, as we have seen, haunted by an abiding sense of female inferiority that both assume to issue from weaker physiology, rather than as a result of historical, structural, social oppression. Both profess in non-fiction a belief in an essence of femininity, even if in fiction they show up the constructed nature of female subjectivity, and, especially in Rachilde's fiction, femininity as performative, to a degree that has led me to write elsewhere about Rachilde as a proto-queer writer. This rigid binary gender logic results, in Rand's case in particular, and Rachilde's to some extent, in a stultifying heteronormativity. Rand assumes heterosexuality as an inevitable. for her fictional heroines and as a superior resort for the natural woman, rather than being aware of it as a compulsory system. I believe this point to be significant. Whether we agree with Rand's political perspective, I find it unlikely with this audience, or find it rebarbative, it is certainly the case that she was not a thinker who accepted commonplaces. Her reversal of the Christian morality of altruism as not only a philosophical error but a form of evil, her insistence on selfishness as the highest virtue, demonstrate a striking ability to think reverse discursively in the Foucauldian sense. Indeed, Rand's radical inversions suggest a relic of her early reading of and love for Foucault's own philosophical inspiration, Friedrich Nietzsche, which she would later deny with the claim that Aristotle alone of the philosophers had influenced her thought and writing. In fact, the counterintuitive alternative ethics that Rand deploys resemble nothing so much as the pronouncements of that other alternative moralist, Nietzsche's Zoroaster, in Also sprach Zarathustra. Here are the terms in which he imagines joyous, virtuous selfishness. The German, thanks to Robert, is on the slide. I shall read the English version. Bestowing virtue, thus did Zarathustra once name the unnameable, and then it happened also, and verily it happened for the first time, that his word blessed selfishness, the wholesome, healthy selfishness that springeth from the powerful soul to which the high body appertaineth, the handsome, triumphing, refreshing body, around which everything becomes a mirror, the pliant, persuasive body, the dancer, whose symbol and epitome is the self-enjoying soul. Of such bodies and soul the self-enjoyment calleth itself virtue. With its words of good and bad doth such self-enjoyment shelter itself, as with sacred groves. With the name of its happiness doth it banish from itself everything contemptible. And Rand describes selfishness thus, placing the words in the mouth of her ideal moral spokesman, John Galt. The first precondition of self-esteem is that radiant selfishness of soul which desires the best in all things, in values of matter and spirit, a soul that seeks above all else to achieve its own moral perfection, valuing nothing higher than itself. There are many more examples I could draw from Rand's texts, where both a quasi-spiritual lexicon and a discourse of psychological health, joy and self-care are deployed in relation to selfishness, in order to replace sacrifice with self-interest as the greatest moral good. Given her capacity for a perverse thinking against the grain, an audacious reverse discursive or argumentation then, the fact that Rand leaves entirely intact some of the most garden variety discourses of misogyny suggests more than anything the cultural and epistemological barriers to the task of imagining what it would truly mean to value the female individual qua individual and rational selfishness as female. So, a corollary in Rand's belief in heterosexuality as a natural and desirable order and hero worship as the properly feminine position is her assertion of the impossibility of imagining a female president of the United States of America. Rand expounds this theory to the great consternation of our audience in the 1979 interview with Donahue, and if you forgive me, I'll show it to you because it's bizarre.
Do you believe that there is going to be a day where there's going to be a female in the White House as president? And how do you feel about that?
I wouldn't vote for her.
You would or wouldn't?
Would not.
Would not.
No.
Why not?
For many reasons.
Nice.
I've written an article about that in my former magazine. You'll have to find out my reasons there.
Yeah.
The magazine is The Objectivist.
Would you not vote for her because she was a woman, even if she were better qualified than any man?
If we had followed that law, I might.
That low? I think you have a very, very low
I'll tell you
opinion of
why.
women.
Let me answer this. It is not to a woman's personal interest to rule man. It puts her in a very unhappy position. I don't believe that any good woman would want that position.
So you are essentially against leadership positions for women then?
No. Oh no. A president is not the only leadership position. There's senators and congressmen
And it's all right for you if they run and be elected?
Oh, certainly, and I work for them. But wait a moment. A commander-in-chief of the army, a woman, I think it's unspeakable.
So in the essay to which she alludes in the clip about a woman president, Rand wrote, "For a woman to seek or desire the presidency is in fact so terrible a prospect of spiritual self-immolation that the woman who would seek it is psychologically unworthy of the job." According to her logic then, a female president may well have the capacity to be a good president, she says this, but in doing so she would become a bad or impossible woman. More radically, she would logically not be a woman. That Rand, a powerful, influential female individualist, should have held these views is lamentable. That they are the views of her containing culture, an influence she would have claimed, of course, did not affect her, is undeniable. This internalized misogyny on the part of Rand, and the wanting to have it both ways, implied by the insistence that woman is not inferior to man, yet she must be able to look up to him, suggests her inability to reconcile the central tenets of her philosophy with her perception of what being a woman meant, the irreducible quality of something in nature called femininity. We have still to see the election of a female president of the United States, but Rand's words shed interesting light upon the particular form of misogyny, both embodied in and produced in response to that consummate female commander-in-chief, Margaret Thatcher. Representations of Thatcher, both discursive and visual, are characterised by a peculiar dualistic and internally contradictory quality. Either the fact of a woman wielding power feminizes the exercise of power and the field of politics, or else, in order to be wielding such power in the first place, Thatcher must really be a man. Rand's objection to the principle of the female president is prescient, as the notion that to govern would involve a betrayal or renunciation or yet a grotesque deformation of what is culturally understood as femininity was amply played out in coverage of Thatcher. In this cartoon, Thatcher's power to swipe Soviet influence off the globe is figuratively diminished by the fact that she is shown to do so using a feather duster, connoting, of course, woman's proper domestic role, and while clutching her iconic black handbag. This chimes with a strong current in political and media discourse throughout the Thatcher years. During the 1979 general election campaign, Dennis Canavan urged voters, quote, "Don't let that witch hang up her curtains in Downing Street." And 10 whole years later, in an article in The Guardian, Marion Bauman reported on a sexist backlash in Parliament designed to undermine the right-wing leader precisely by referencing her femininity. Tory MP Emma Nicholson is convinced that a bitter anti-woman undercurrent is flaring up in Parliament, and not just on the Labour benches. They will use anything to attack the Prime Minister, and I think they're sacrificing their acceptance of women as equals to get at her. Inside and outside Westminster, there's talk of political challengers being handbagged, of curtains being bought for the retirement home in Dulwich, of baby minding the new grandson. At other times, however, in a completely contradictory logic, Thatcher is figured as a token man in a dress, an honorary member of the Old Boys Club. In this cartoon, in which she is depicted waltzing with Ronald Reagan, the caption, borrowed from the words not of Reagan, but of German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, tell us that she is still the best man in Europe. The romantic overtones of the image of a dancing power couple has ambiguous shades of political homosociality, with the figuring of Thatcher as a man, smooching with her American equal Reagan, a bitterly ironic undertone given the repressive homophobic policies of Thatcher's regime. In exploring the attitudes of Rachilde and Rand, we have seen that both faced extraordinary levels of inner conflict and uneasy contradiction with regard to their desire to live, act and write as individuals, while also holding regressive ideas about womanhood that poisoned and undermined their vaunted self-regard. Thatcher's representation reveals a similar constant contradiction and dissonance, played out much more visibly on the surface of her person as a public figure. To achieve election on a Tory ticket in the 1970s, Thatcher could not have appeared to be anything other than an ultra-gender conformist conservative woman, fitting that classist and sexist category, a lady. Hence the exaggeratedly boofed femme helmet of golden hair, the perfect makeup, and the fussy pussycat bow blouses that were so easy to caricature in cartoons and for spitting image. Called upon to police conservative ideas of traditional womanhood and family values on the one hand, all the while being the only real man in the cabinet and the best man in Europe for the purposes of bellicose national interest, Thatcher embodied Rand's claim that a woman taking on the role of primary would be placed in a position of constant schizoid tension and self-contradiction. Yet I would argue that Rand's mistake is in believing that this is because the essential nature of woman would be at odds with the desire to rule, rather than because the rigidity of the patriarchal edict regarding what women may properly be would be contradicted by inappropriate desire for power. Public hatred of Thatcher was freighted with so much more than hatred of her politics. Thatcher's famous speech, that is metonymically referred to by its key soundbite, "The ladies not for turning," voiced, despite the dogmatic intransigence of the literal message it conveyed, a refusal to reconsider regulation of the economy, a chilling echo of an age-old misogyny. Thatcher figures herself in the third person, the lady, the female cipher. The turning draws attention to the silenced rhyme word, burning, that it puts under erasure, reminding us of the punishment meted out to deviant women who threatened to encroach upon male authority and were scapegoated as witches in the burning times. And the brutal misogyny of the language of witch burning returns in the commonly seen and heard response to the death of the hated former Prime Minister in the repetition of the slogan and song, "Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead." That a woman's death is being sadistically celebrated here in specifically misogynistic terms, rather than simply the death of an unpopular and ruthless former leader, is an issue that it is ethically incumbent upon us not to overlook, regardless of our view of Thatcher's policies. So I am reaching a conclusion. An article that appeared just the other day in New York Magazine Online, entitled "Ayn Rand Girl Power Icon," asks whether her right-wing politics and flip misogyny necessarily prevent her being a source of feminist inspiration for contemporary women. Noting that an approximation of a well-known quotation from Rand's 1943 novel The Fountainhead, "The question isn't who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me," appears on t-shirts and Etsy jewellery designed for women, the journalist asks whether one should divorce the less politically savoury elements of Rand's textual corpus from its message of resilience, independence and ambition that can seem inspiring to women. The brand of feminism to which this article alludes and appeals is in fact precisely the so-called post-feminism which I described at the beginning of the lecture. Rand's ideology and this brand of neoliberal girl power may seem to be relatively compatible. Both advocate the interests of an individual who does not make common cause with others based on class-based politics, and who refuses to think in terms of the collective. Both are powered, of course, by capitalistic logic and market forces, and appeal to an upwardly mobile, ostensibly white, middle-class, educated woman. Yet, a much more invidious commonality between Rand and the third wave feminism is the internalization in both of values that may be to the counter-interest of both individual women and women as a group. Post-feminism has been critiqued as patriarchy repackaged. That is, in being encouraged to choose, for example, cosmetic surgery, a certain style of clothing, pole dancing as recreational activity, women are lured into internalizing and aping an image of their role that issues from the male-oriented heteronormative status quo, cunningly repurposed as empowering options. They literally wear their feminism lightly in the guise of girl power flavoured t-shirts. In Ariel Levy's words, women operating in this worldview become female chauvinist pigs, individually shoring up sexism and seeking acceptance on masculinist terms while selling short their interests as women. Rand's core definition of selfishness, as expressed in the introduction of her collection of essays, called, of course, The Virtue of Selfishness, is, quote, concern with one's own interests. Rand's deep-seated view of women as inferior and her belief in a masochistic essence called femininity both belie the surface-level claims that objectivism offers both men and women the opportunity to hold the self as one's own highest value. Her dogmatic refusal to accept that interests may sometimes have to be defined on a group basis, such as the basis of class woman, as well as defined at the individual level, is in stark logical contradiction to her willingness to herd women together as a psychologically definable group, characterized by a propensity for hero worship. To clarify, if one can claim that women share as a group something called psychological femininity, then one cannot also logically claim that feminism is a groundless movement based on a falsely construed group interest. Let us consider one last time our selfish women. Rachilde, man of letters. Ayn Rand, the most courageous man in America. Margaret Thatcher, the best man in Europe. The message that women cannot be strong individualists and that those exceptional women who are somehow really are men is a pervasive cross-cultural fantasy and a form of subjectification that these selfish women also internalise. I've been arguing precisely that the selfish women's internalised misogyny suggests the true sticking point of a theory of selfishness that is as available to women as it is to men. In fact, an ethic of specifically female selfishness may be so elusive as to be largely unarticulated. That would be a selfishness that fully comprehends the social constraints placed on women and is able to ask whether a given aim is in a woman's interests, not only as an individual, but also as a person who has been situated by the social order as a woman, that is, as woman function. Such a brand of selfishness, or self-fullness, is, in the words Rand used in another context, an unknown ideal, something we have not yet properly tested. My fascination with these inconvenient deviants is precisely that not only external reactions to them, but also their own abreactions in the form of deflections, contradictions, self-hatred, aporia, when faced with the problem of theorizing true self-interest for women, tell us so much about what we are not quite allowed to be. Thank you.